Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club. I am Stephen Squeri, Chair of the Board of Directors for the Center for Community Solutions and an attorney with the Jones Day firm here in Cleveland. Let me start by saying that it is an honor to be here today at the City Club, the great citadel of free speech here in Cleveland, and for the honor of introducing Senator Olympia Snowe. Community Solutions is pleased to partner with the City Club on this program during the centennial year for Community Solutions, which was founded in 1913. As a nonpartisan organization engaged in research and policy analysis, we welcome opportunities such as this to encourage stimulating discussions on how public policy affects people in Ohio. In government, as in a traffic jam, little to nothing gets done when gridlock happens. We are currently seeing a level of dysfunction in government different from anything we have seen in the past. While there are many contributing factors, part of this gridlock can be attributed to the increasingly rigid ideology on both sides of the political aisle. Our speaker today is a distinguished American politician and a former senator from Maine. Olympia Snowe first ran for state senate in 1973 at the age of 26. She moved on to the US House of Representatives in 1978, representing Maine's 2nd Congressional District. With her election to the US Senate in 1994, Senator Snowe began an 18-year career during which she became known as, quote, the moderate Republican from Maine. Senator Snowe became very well known for her ability to compromise and her sense of bipartisanship while in office. In 2006, she was named one of America's best senators by Time magazine. Senator Snowe retired in January of this year, citing the extreme degree of partisanship in Congress. Many of us were disappointed and dismayed to see the departure of a moderate conservative, someone known for her ability to occupy the middle ground, reach across the table, and build consensus. Very soon after leaving the Senate, Senator Snowe wrote a book, Fighting for Common Ground: How We Can Fix the Stalemate in Congress. Instead of just writing a memoir, as many of her colleagues have done, Senator Snowe chose to focus on the problem of hyper-partisanship. She characterizes our current situation as, quote, governing by brinksmanship and deferral and deadline. More importantly, however, she explains what Americans can do to push back on our elected officials and demand that they find a better way to govern effectively. Obviously, this is a topic of great importance to all of us, given what is going on in Washington, particularly right now as we all sit here today. Thus, today, Senator Snowe will share with us her views on what's gone wrong in Washington and why it doesn't have to be this way. Ladies and gentlemen, and our broadcast audience, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Olympia Snowe, who will present the annual Eugene H. Friedheim Address as part of the Community Solutions year-long Human Services Institute. Senator Snowe.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Steve, for that very gracious and generous introduction, and also for the very warm reception and welcome that I've received here this morning. In exchange, I promised to heed the advice that was given to me by a very wise man who told me, Olympia, a great speech is one with a good beginning and good ending, which are kept very close together. So I promised to heed that advice. Well, a good beginning is, again, to convey my appreciation to Steve for so eloquently expressing the views, and I think for all of us and what we're facing in Washington, what is occurring, And I thank you so much for those very kind words. And also to all of you for the opportunity to be able to address the Center for Community Solutions here at the august and the iconic City Club as part of the Center's 71st Annual Human Services Institute. I'm delighted to be able to be here. I also want to recognize the Director of the Center for Community Solutions, John Begler, for his more than 12 years of exemplary leadership, and also for Steve's unyielding commitment to the organization. I also thank you for making me feel very much at home, because Bill Ginn Sr. is here, and his son lives in Maine and has for almost 4 decades, and is an environmental leader not only in Maine but across the country. And I was talking to my husband last night, and I told him that Bill's father was going to be here, and he said, well, remind him about the fact that 38 years ago, when we were all in the state legislature, and Bill was then heading up the Maine Audubon Society, that they led the initiative for the returnable bottle bill. Which again was quite forward-thinking and progressive at the time, because I think there were only a couple of other states that had already adopted that legislation. So it's great to see you here as well, Bill. When I think about what the Center does and the enormous contributions that it provides for enhancing the quality of life here in Ohio, I'm also reminded of the degree to which individuals have a tremendous capacity to help so many others in life, and the amazing role that the Center is playing as a linchpin for more than 100 years, which I understand we'll be celebrating tomorrow night here, for providing in-depth, credible research and analysis. The facts do matter. And facts matter whether or not you have limited resources and how you deliver those resources. It matters for the people who depend on those services. It matters for developing the right legislative solutions. The facts matter for developing nonpartisan solution, as the Center does. It matters for nurturing the right economic growth and opportunity for all people. Now, doesn't that sound like Washington? I think they could borrow a page out of your book, frankly, both on terms of the research and the facts do matter. And of course, the standards that are applied by the City Club and being for 100 years the longest running continuous free forum for independent speech. I think forums such as this are so critical to understanding the disparate views that might exist, and also being a refuge for thoughtful and respectful debate and exchange of ideas are essential. It's essential to all of us who live in a community. It's essential for our state. It is essential for our democracy, and certainly now more than ever. So I certainly want to applaud the City Club for that long-running standard, and thank you, Paul, for your extraordinary leadership of this treasure for not only Ohio, but for the country. I mean, your reputation is renowned. And so I thank you for what you're doing and the standard that you set for the kind of discourse that should be established in America. I also want to recognize and do a shout out to a former staff person of mine, Ray Kerncevic, who is now the Associate General Counsel for the University Hospitals here in Cleveland. He's a native of Cleveland, and he was my legislative director in the United States Senate, but the pull became too great to come back to Ohio with his wonderful family, and his parents, of course, still live here. And Ray did an exceptional job for me. So when I talk about the facts do matter, it resonates with Ray, because he'd come before me with, you know, the different propositions and issues coming before the Senate. And I said, well, tell me the facts, because oftentimes it was the facts that really could determine the merits and the worthiness of the argument and the positions, irrespective if it's a Republican idea or a Democratic idea. You know, was it the right idea based on the facts? And Ray would always deliver the facts. So it's great to see you, Ray, and thank you for being here. I do want to discuss what's gone wrong in Washington, what has contributed to this breakdown that has undermined our political system, and what we can do to change it and put the government and the Congress back on track. This is unbelievably my first of 40 years that I'm no longer in the legislative branch of government. So it's an unusual experience for me, 34 of which was spent in Washington in both the House and the Senate. And as you can imagine, over that period of time, I've had some good experiences and some not so good. I'm also thinking of a story that the late Senator Charles Mathias from Maryland, told me once. He was a moderate Republican, and he happened to have a home on the island of Idaho in the state of Maine, which is off the coast, and it requires taking a ferry from the mainland. And so one day he was on the ferry, and the ferry operator recognized him. He said, "You're Senator Mathias, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And they began a discussion. In the course of the conversation, the man says to Senator Mathias, he said, "There must be a lot of smart people down in Washington, aren't there?" And Senator Mathias says, "Yes, there are a lot of smart people in Washington." And so they continued on, and the man said to him, "Well, I bet there's some people who aren't so smart too, right?" And Senator Mathias says, "Yeah, I guess I would have to agree with you on that as well." And to which the ferry operator quickly replied, "And it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference." So, in any event, there actually, it probably was funny then, maybe not so funny now because it's closer to reality, but actually there are some very smart people in Washington. And I had, the opportunity throughout my tenure to witness some very positive experiences as a result, of collaboration and conciliation during my time. Because it was important to be able to work together. But obviously, so much has changed in that regard that has made a profound difference. And, when I first came to Congress in '79, we collaborated. As a congresswoman, there were only 16 women in the House of Representatives, 1 woman in the United States Senate, and we worked together in the Congressional Caucus on women's issues and changed the laws that were working against women, whether it was on pension reform, whether it was on child support enforcement that was viewed as a woman's problem, or family and medical leave that took 7 years because it was not the law of the land, or the discriminatory policies at the National Institutes of Health that excluded women and minorities from clinical study trials that made the difference between life and death. And we, launched a major effort to change all that. In fact, at the time, the National Institutes of Health was spearheaded by Dr. Bernadine Healy, who was affiliated with the Cleveland Clinic, a very, extraordinary woman. And she helped us, and she helped to launch the Women's Health Initiative, the most far-reaching clinical study trial ever done on women that is still producing life-saving discoveries to this day on women's health. That is the benefit of working together. In 1981, after President Reagan was elected, facing a very serious time in our country, both internationally with the hostage-taking crisis in Iran, as well as the domestic crisis between energy, double-digit unemployment, inflation, and interest rates, and he had to engineer a bold recovery plan. How did he do it? He did it by building a coalition between Republicans and Democrats, which I was a part of, in the U.S. House of Representatives, because it was a Democratic House. But he understood that you had to build those bridges and work together. In President George H.W. Bush, when he had to build a coalition to repel Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, how did he do it? First, he did it internationally for 6 to 7 months leading up to the war. But secondly, he also built it internally among members of Congress as well, and ultimately was successful. He also brokered a pivotal budget agreement for which he paid a political price, but he did it because he thought it was in the best interest of this country. President Clinton, when he came, and he was President of the United States, he had a Republican Congress after the election of 1994. And he believed in triangulation and staking out positions between his party and the Republican Party, and focused on the issues that mattered at the time to Republicans, which was balanced budgets, welfare reform, and tax cuts. And in fact, I well recall when he gave a State of the Union address, he mentioned all of these issues that were viewed to be Republican issues, and we know that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And former President Reagan was prompted to say at the time, he said, that's tantamount to grand larceny. But President Clinton understood how you got it done, and guess what? We had balanced budgets for 4 consecutive years that produced surpluses for the first time since the 1930s. In 2001, in the aftermath of Bush-Gore decision that was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court, I was co-chairing the centrist coalition with John Breaux, who's a Democrat from Louisiana. And we invited the leadership, the Senate Majority Leader, Trent Lott, and Senator Daschle, the Minority Leader, because we were concerned between the fact that we had this, contentious decision that's handed down by the court, and we now were having a 50-50 Senate, evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, that we would lose the ability to drive an agenda through on important issues, and it would derail the legislative possibilities. So we wanted to demonstrate that bipartisanship was alive and well. We had more than, 30 senators show up for that meeting. It worked, and President George W. Bush was able to pass the largest tax cut in history in the first 6 months, because Americans were facing the largest tax cut, largest tax burden in the history of our country since World War II. So the point was they were able to work together, in addition to also being able to enact major educational reforms in conjunction with Senator Ted Kennedy. The point is collaboration and the can-do spirit that applied, in all of those instances, delivered the results that obviously isn't happening today. And that's why, I made, the consequential decision that I did, facing the cold, stark reality that the polarization would not diminish in the short term. And as we see today, with the perilous inaction and the dynamics that are underway in Washington, it's grown ever worse, even since the last election. Imagine we've had an intervening election, and yet it hasn't diminished the partisanship that's necessary to turning this economy around and to redirecting our focus to the future. If you think about it, it was 2 years ago with the polarization and partisanship induced, the debt ceiling debacle that triggered the downgrade of our AAA credit rating for the first time in our history, that culminated, according to 3 economists' report, the highest level of policy uncertainty in the history of our country in the last 20 years, surpassing any events such as the Persian Gulf War, or the catastrophic events of September 11th, the Iran and Afghanistan wars, as well as the financial crisis. That was the degree to which it sent shockwaves not only around the country, but around the world. And of course, the last Congress was bookended by the so-called fiscal cliff agreement. And that was the expiration of the tax rates, as well as the automatic cuts that were developed as a result of the debt ceiling agreement, but were lapsing at the end of the year. And we ultimately had a vote on New Year's Day at 2 o'clock in the United States Senate, which was my final vote. But also, I think it was illustrative of a process gone seriously awry that, that required having a vote on New Year's Day. It's not as if we had a cram-packed legislative scheduled all year long and we couldn't avoid the question. But it just demonstrated our inability to get things done. And yes, it is, this deferral, and delay and default in which we're running our country, lurching from one self-engineered crisis to another that has resulted in legislating by brinkmanship and deferral. Which brings us to August 2nd of this year, which was the 2-year anniversary of the debt ceiling crisis. And this House had only been in session 101 days out of the 213, and the United States Senate 95 out of the, the legislative session on the entire year, and yet they went on a 5-week recess. Now, one thing that is predictable about Congress is recesses. They take their recess schedule. Although I understand the House is canceling their recess next week, so things are really serious. But the point of it is that knowing that this looming prospect of a potential government shutdown when they returned, because the end of the fiscal year is the end of this month, end of September, and then secondly, the reprisal of the possibilities of another debt ceiling crisis for mid-October because the government's going to run out of money. And yet they predictably took their 5-week recess. And of course, no budget. As one of the Capitol Hill newspapers described it, the Farm Bill hasn't been done, the appropriation process is in shambles, and the immigration reform is stagnant, and yet they head for the exits. You know, you would think that Congress by now, given all that's happened over the last few years, that they wouldn't want to put the country through more economic and emotional travail and trauma, because they knew they were going to come back a week after Labor Day, you know, to have to resolve these questions. And yet they didn't anticipate the unexpected, which was the complex and difficult issue concerning launching strikes in Syria, which is now on diplomatic hold. But it does underscore the degree to which we have shortchanged the capacity of this country to tackle big issues because we are running this country by deferral, delay, and default. When I was, you know, a member of the Senate Finance Committee, we were discussing the prospects of having a shutdown, and the chairman convened the committee thinking, what could we do to avert it? And I was arguing we should do everything that we can, come up with a debt reduction agreement for the long term so that we could attach it to the raising the debt ceiling. And I said we could not, you know, lose precious time in the life of America. We've lost so much precious time deferring on these issues. But unfortunately, it didn't materialize, and the status quo prevailed. Well, as Tom Friedman discussed in his recent call, it was in April, as a matter of fact, this very point. He said, we have wasted a 5-year timeout from a geopolitical conflict when we could have been focusing on healing the economy. You know, we didn't have to face a global rattling conflict. And yet there are multiple actors out there, he said as he went on, that are about to draw red lines in the sand, and he enumerated countries, including, of course, Syria, which is exactly what happened. And so the point is here that the status quo, where you place politics over policies, has betrayed the opportunities that have been lost that Tom Friedman discussed, and it also has betrayed the can-do spirit that has always been the hallmark of this country. The art of legislating has virtually been abandoned for the gotcha politics of today, which is to say that you are advantaging one side and disadvantaging the other, to leverage your position to the maximum so you can take the issue to the next election. It's about messaging. Legislating is now messaging. We're going to send a message, you know, through various amendments, positions on issues, how you structure the votes, so that you can get the other side on record on that vote, and then they can encapsulate it in a 30-second ad that they can use in the next election. So everything becomes about the next election and nothing about governing for the moment. Now, the congressional budget process is a case in point. The regular order, which you're going to hear a lot of, is regular order, doing your, you know, normal course of business on a daily basis has virtually been lost in Congress, and certainly that is true with respect to the budget and the appropriation process. In fact, the United States of America has been operating without a budget for 4 years. I mean, the largest economy in the world has no budget. Imagine it. Now, this year they passed with much fanfare, no budget, no pay. That's to a point. There is no budget if each chamber failed to pass a measure. But it didn't say that they wouldn't get their pay if the budget didn't become law, which is required by April 15th. And obviously that hasn't occurred. And so ultimately what we have is this potential government shutdown because of those 12 appropriation bills, not one of which has become law. Only 4 passed in the House of Representatives and 0 have passed in the United States Senate. And yet there are only 6 legislative days remaining in this month before the beginning of the fiscal year, or obviously the government shutdown, which is what this debate is all about. And what's incredible about it all is that obviously leaders on both sides recognize that to either have a government shutdown or failing to raise the debt ceiling is a disastrous path for this country. Now, the Democrats and Republicans, we recognize, are like ships passing in the night. One's in the Atlantic and one's in the Pacific. And unfortunately, they have passed very different budgets. They're widely divergent politically and philosophically, without question, one in the Republican House and one in the Democratic Senate. But these budgets ultimately have become about drawing ideological battle plans rather than a blueprint for America's fiscal future. And it isn't so much the fact that $90 to $100 billion separates both of these budgets. That wouldn't be insurmountable under normal legislative conditions. But what the problem is that what separates them philosophically is almost light years on the keystone questions of entitlement spending, on taxes, and on a potential debt ceiling agreement. And therefore, it's hard telling how you dislodge either side from its ideological camps to get anything done. You know, as one Politico, the Capitol Hill newspaper, was describing it as, you can't compare these versions like apples and oranges. They're more like apples and bicycles because they're just so vastly different. And obviously, there's no impetus to get anything done. And so what they're replicating right now is dual self-inflicted wounds with this prospect of a shutdown and the failure to raise the debt ceiling, which is going to come in mid-October. And what's exacerbating the problem, of course, is the fact that you have differences within the parties and the tensions that ensue from that as well. There's one camp of Republicans who saying we're not going to either vote for a continuing resolution or raise the debt ceiling without defunding the Affordable Care Act, which I understand has already been voted on in the House of Representatives today with respect to the continuing resolution. And the Republican leaders understand that you have to balance that strategy with the reality that the President has adamantly rejected that proposition in affecting or limiting his signature issue when it comes to the Affordable Care Act. And so you have, those competing problems. In addition, what's complicating the scenario is that the Democrats would like to ease the impact with the automatic cuts on social programs and take it from raising taxes. The Republicans, on the other hand, are saying, well, no, we want to mitigate the impact on defense and extract those savings from entitlement reforms and or cuts. And the Democrats are saying, well, no, it has to be part of a broader agreement and it has to include tax increases. And the Republicans are saying, well, no, we've already given it the office. We accepted tax increases as part of the fiscal cliff agreement at the beginning of this year, and so therefore we will not embrace any further revenue increases. So, that's the juxtaposition of what we're dealing with right now, and that's what's undergirding the gridlock and the dysfunction as it exists and the two current issues before the United States Congress. So inevitably, the leaders and the President are going to have to figure out a path forward. Frankly, the President and the leaders, on a bipartisan basis, on a bicameral basis, ought to be meeting and developing a fiscal summit and a framework from which to address these issues, not just for the short term, but for the long term, because it's such an imperative. And it's not only with respect to shutting down the government. If you think of the imminent prospects of not failing to raise the debt ceiling and obviously compromising and jeopardizing the full faith and credit of the United States of America. Now, the Speaker has said, I'm not going to support raising the debt ceiling without cuts that are equal to or greater than the raising the debt ceiling. And as I said, the President's not going to accept any preconditions and has said the debt ceiling and the full faith and credit of America is non-negotiable. So where they go from here obviously remains to be seen, but it isn't positive for the country because we know we can do better. Now they may decide, like they did earlier this year, to suspend raising the debt ceiling, which they did. Now you would have thought they would have taken that as a prime window of opportunity to forge a permanent agreement to avoid this crisis scenario, but that obviously wasn't to be the case. I guess the point of all of this is that it's in the context in which we live today, and that is the subpar economic growth and the high unemployment that continues to persist and to plague our economy. I think we know that. And the very fact that, we're adding 169,000 jobs, but at this rate, we won't return to pre-recession levels of 2007 employment numbers until 6 years from now. So, as one economist said, we're treading water. So we have the lowest number of employed Americans in 35 years. We have the greatest income inequality since the 1920s. So something has got to give. And we, should not accept the lowest common denominator when it comes to legislating and governing our country on these consequential matters that have been overlooked and neglected for so long. And yes, we are in uncharted waters with respect to the debt. Now, they'll herald the fact, yes, the deficit's coming down this year, but that's the short term because of two one-time events that brought down the deficit. As the Congressional Budget Office said this week, we are traversing perilous waters because our debt rate now is 73% of the gross domestic product. At the end of 2007, it was 36%. And it's scheduled to increase to 77% of the gross domestic product. Okay, so I don't think I have to draw a picture. And exacerbating that problem is, of course, that there are going to be 77 million Americans who are going to be retiring over the next 20 years, which is a rate of 10,000 a day, and what that portends for Medicare and Medicaid in the Social Security program. So that's what's compounding the serious nature of the problem. It isn't that we can't solve these problems. We can, if they were willing to do it. I think the real question is, how we stem the corrosive impact of congressional inertia and inactivity that is affecting the future prosperity of this country. It isn't that it isn't insurmountable, it is. But we're immersed in a very, difficult and harsh political environment. You look at tax reform is another question. Both chairmen agree. They've been in sync on this for the last several years. They said they even worn a path between their offices over the last few years to develop an agenda to get it done because the code is imploding under the changes of more than 15,000 since 1986. Think about it, 15,000, and yet nothing can happen, nor is there any possibility, as it stands right now, before the Congress. And yet this could have laid the groundwork for a robust economic recovery, which hasn't happened. And we have the worst post-recession recovery in the history of our country. Simply because we haven't addressed the fundamentals of tax reform and regulatory reform, the ground game rules that are essential for business and individuals to make investments, to take the risk, to make our economy grow. You don't get immigration reform. There seems some optimism there in the Senate and with a bipartisan package, which they handled on the basis of a normal legislative course and process, but unfortunately it's now languishing in the House, and it's a real question as to whether or not it is even possible to get that done this year. Even if it passes the House, how you reconcile, which obviously going to be two very different propositions when it comes to that question. Finally, I think, above and beyond everything else, is that, where do we go from here? What has contributed, to this fractiousness? And everywhere I go, people ask me, why is it so challenging to achieve, bipartisan solutions in today's environment? And that's what really prompted me to think about my future in the Senate and, what it would be like. And I decided I would take my fight outside of the institution. I didn't think the change could occur within the institution of the Senate. Not that I didn't love the Senate or believe in its potential, but precisely because I do. But I thought I could use my experience and my voice on the outside to reaffirm the public's frustration, but more than that, to do something about it. And as I describe in my book, and I decided to write a book, and that was not on my agenda, frankly. Somebody once said, it's fun to have written a book, it's not fun to write a book. I discovered that, especially in a compressed period of time. But I did it because I wanted to lay out, and I wanted to let people know, and including, those in Washington, yes, it can be different, and it has been. You need bipartisan, legislative partnerships to get things done. It's crucial to minimizing the barriers and maximizing the possibilities and the potential of what it's all about. The problem is, we no, the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer, and that's been demonstrated with, statistics. For example, in 1987, there were 57 senators who were of one party, but their states voted for the presidential candidate of the opposing party. Today, there are only 21 senators in that position in the United States Senate. So for 79% of the Senate, there really is not much political incentive to cross the political aisle for fear, of a primary challenge. Nate Silver, who's a statistician was working for the New York Times, and he's now doing his own consulting, but he said in analyzing the House of Representatives that over the last 20 years, in 1992, there were 102 seats that were competitive in the House of Representatives, but today there are only 35. Now, the National Journal, which is a highly respected publication as well on Capitol Hill, had been evaluating voting trends in Congress since 1982. And at that point, they determined there were 58 senators who came between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. That means that over half the Senate occupied the middle ground. Today, for the third year in a row, and for the fourth time ever, the number of senators who fall into that category is literally zero. So there's no Democrat who's more, conservative than a Republican. There's no Republican more liberal than a Democrat. So there's no crossover. In the House of Representatives in 1982, there were unbelievably 344 members who were willing to work on a bipartisan basis and cross over and support bipartisan initiatives. Today, there are only 13. So you can see, I think, how dramatic the political landscape has changed, that has been infused by the new politics that's given rise to this, enhanced and intense hyper-partisanship that has really enveloped the environment in Washington. When it comes to institutional knowledge, more than half the Senate has served less than 6 years. It wasn't so long ago there were 44 senators who had at least, 3 terms of experience. Today it's down to 32. And the House of Representatives, only more than half have served less than 6 years. So, what that is suggesting then is that many lawmakers know of no other legislative environment other than the one they're currently immersed in. And so ultimately, it produces, I think, the enhanced divide that you're witnessing day in and day out in the United States Congress. The fact is it's contributed to a historic low level of inactivity, to the point that last Congress was the least productive since 1947. And President Truman described that Congress, the 80th Congress, as a do-nothing Congress, and yet they passed 906 pieces of legislation. In the last Congress, they passed 283. Today, to this point, it may have changed since the last time I looked, but it was like 31 bills became law this year. You could say, well, you don't have to pass laws to, make things happen, but, nothing has happened. At the end of last year, our approval rating was 10%, and one of my colleagues said, wow, he said, I wonder who that 10% is that thinks that Congress is actually doing a good job. I'll leave it to you. Of course, it went up a few points, about 5 points recently, and so they said, well, that's really because probably people think it's an improvement that Congress is doing nothing. Is sort of safe it that way, but it really is a travesty. Oftentimes, I had the impetus to go to the floor of the United States Senate and do a refresher course on how a bill becomes law, like in Schoolhouse Rocks, how it all started. Get back to the normal course of business, the regular order that you'll hear so much about. It's the normal legislative process that infuses the ability to work together. Amendments, and debate spawn new ideas and create, the notion for how you build a bridge to get there from here, as they say in Maine. And that is the point of it all, and that's what's been lost. And so when people ask me, well, what do we do to change it? Well, first of all, there are rewards and there are penalties. And I think we have to start rewarding and championing those who are willing to work across the political aisle, willing to compromise, and willing to build consensus. Because compromise, as somebody has said, is not a dirty word. And we have to penalize those who don't. I mean, frankly, we have to reap those rewards and penalties, yes, at the ballot box, but also in the meantime, in real time, and form a catalyst, for change. I mean, after all, that change is literally at our fingertips with online technology and social media. Just as those who have fanned the flames of polarization that spawned, groups like Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street and infinite other groups, that weigh in and influence the process. How did the FAA get changed on cutting back on air traffic controllers through the automatic cuts? Well, members of Congress didn't want to be sitting in those planes idling on the tarmac, and the pilot saying, well, this is due to congressional budget cuts. And so they immediately, in congressional time, which was almost nanoseconds, they did something about it, right? I mean, because, that's the way it is. And that's what we have to do. I have created Olympia's List. It's a multi-candidate committee. I'm going to support the initiatives that's so important and support those candidates who are willing to work across the political aisle, because that's what it's all about. I supported the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm a senior fellow, co-founded by 4 former majority leaders, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and we have a commission for political reform, in fact, having an event here in Ohio in October, because we think it is so important. And finally, I just want to say, we are a representative democracy, and we get the government we demand. And we need to reward and value bipartisanship and consensus. The forces for division are great. They're well organized and they're united. And they'll do everything to thwart action and to invite incendiary rhetoric to continue and persist in those divisions. Warren Rudman, the late senator from New Hampshire, once said, politics is too important to be left to the politicians. He couldn't be more right. So I would hope that all of us will be engaged in this process, in joining organizations that will help to communicate with your lawmakers and using social media, and to know we can demand a change. I want to return Congress to being the solution-driven powerhouse that it once was, and reflective of the great country that we are. Thank you.
As president of the City Club's Board of Directors, I would like to extend a special thank you and welcome to our honorable speaker. I think we're going to have to invite you back for part 2, actually. Now, we are going to return to you momentarily for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We'll have time for a few questions, and I would ask you to start formulating your questions now. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via broadcast on WVIZ PBS 90.3 WCPN and also 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, WTAM, or one of the many radio, broadcast partners across the country. I'm trying to speak faster so we can get to the question, so I'm sorry about that. Broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. For more information about our upcoming forums, to make a reservation or to order a CD or DVD of one of our many programs, please refer to our website, and that's www.cityclub.org. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by the Center for Community Solutions, John Carroll University, the Northeast Ohio Media Group, who is the City Club sponsor for policy and politics, and the Sisters of Charity Health System. Thank you all for your support. Today is the Center for Community Solutions annual Eugene H. Freedheim Lecture, part of the 71st Human Services Institute. We are delighted to partner with the Center to present this program. Today is also the annual Richard and Patricia Pogue Funded Forum, made possible by a generous gift from Dick and Pat Pogue to the City Club Forum Foundation. Dick has joined us at the head table today. Pat was unable to be here today, but we certainly love them both and greatly appreciate your long-standing, wonderful support of the City Club, and I'd ask you, Dick, to stand and be recognized. We also welcome students to today's program. Student participation is made possible by a generous gift from the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Fund. Today, we welcome students from Brecksville Broadview Heights High School and St. Martin de Porres High School. Will the students please stand and be recognized? And now with that rapid set of announcements, we are ready to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club Q&A period. We welcome questions from everyone here in the room today, including our students. Holding the microphones today are City Club Development Association Associate Mike Cromaldi. Where's Mike? There's Mike. And also Program Director Kerry Miller. First question, please.
Senator, welcome to the Cleveland City Club. Seems to me that there are structural problems in the United States Congress. For example, the gerrymandered districts in Ohio, there are 16 congressmen, 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats, yet more people in Ohio voted for Democrats for the House in the last election. In the Senate, you need 60 votes, not a majority, but 60 votes to cut off debate on many issues, which make it impossible even if there's a majority in favor of the legislation. Do you agree with these structural problems, and how do we correct it?
Yes, very good questions. Certainly I think that redistricting is a serious problem. I think as evidenced by the homogenation of districts that, as I said earlier, there are very few competitive seats that basically ends up being predetermined even before the election. And that's why I espouse independent redistricting commissions that can be adopted by state legislatures, and I would urge you, to get involved in that effort, in that initiative, to drive it. And maybe a dozen states have independent redistricting commissions. For example, Maine has one that was established by the legislature but has an independent chair. And I think it's really important to move in that direction, to lay the groundwork for the next reapportionment, which of course is going to be in 2020. That's the best way for people to get involved. It's closer to home because you can deal with your state legislatures, and that's really what should happen, because obviously it has now resulted in the kind of divide that's occurred with no competition in these congressional seats. In the United States Senate, yes, it does require 60 votes, and the whole institution was designed around the notion of accommodating consensus. It wasn't designed as a majority rule institution, and so it's predicated majority rule, but it accommodates the rights of the minority. And so over the years it has worked pretty well, up until maybe, this last decade, where it's really been exacerbated by the use of the filibuster. I think there are ways to eliminating the filibuster, because I think that's a part of the institutional traditions of the Senate. It always has been since its founding. What they can do is to have live filibusters. That makes it more difficult. Right now they're not discomforted by filibusters because no one has to be there live to do it. They can pick up the phone and call from the airport, essentially. We need to change that. That is one way if they can't reach an agreement and accord between the two leaders. The two leaders have to communicate, to eliminate the roadblocks that occur in reflecting the interests of their caucuses. So they've got to talk to one another. And that's really important. And also the individual members of the Senate have to understand, what's constructive and what's not productive. So one of the ways of curtailing that would be to use a live filibuster, because right now, if they don't have live filibusters, they can continue on to do other business and just set that aside, rather than being forced to deal with the issue until they can overcome that live filibuster. Thank you.
Senator Snowe, thank you for your interesting remarks. During that 5-week recess you mentioned that Congress took, I was in Western North Carolina, and I went to the local congressman's town hall meeting. He's a newly elected freshman Republican from a safe Republican district due to the redistricting last time. I went because I was curious how he'd handle the meeting, and here's what I found. One is all questions had to be in writing, and a staff member read the questions to the congressman. They did introduce the person who'd asked the question so the congressman could address the person directly, but there were no follow-up questions. So it was a very controlled environment, obviously. Secondly, he started the meeting with statements about inefficiency in government and cited 2 examples, mostly with duplicative spending in departments, and I forget what the other one was exactly, but based on administrative things. He made no comments about inefficiency in government related to the Congress or the House of Representatives, which, as you pointed out, hadn't passed very many appropriations bills, and he's a part of the majority party. But we couldn't ask him a question about that because he wasn't allowing any follow-up questions. Is this typical of the current instructions that Republicans get or anybody gets
I don't
when
know.
they go back to talk to their district? Is my
Well, let's just say I couldn't get away with that in Maine. Just no way. You know, oftentimes I would say to my colleagues, well, who do you talk to when you go home? I know who I talk to. And I made a point of conducting Main Street tours because they're unfettered and unfiltered, and you get a real appreciation of what's going on in a particular community, and people are more apt to come up and say things, and you stay in touch. It's the pulse and the lifeblood of communities, and I learned so much. I didn't have to take a poll. You know, I always could pretty much calibrate what was going on and got some great ideas, as a matter of fact. I believe that staying in touch with people and connecting with people of all diverse views, and that's the beauty of competitiveness, because I'm a Republican in what is a blue state, Maine. So I heard many voices. I wasn't just Republican voices, not Democrats or independents. They were a blend. I was equally divided. And so I heard many voices. I had to sort it out. You know, so oftentimes we'll say moderates, you know, they're wishy-washy and so on. No, moderates had to figure it out because there are few of us left in the process, and you have to figure out the facts and the merits of the issue, as Ray will tell you, what works and what doesn't work. And that's the problem. I think that Washington has become disconnected and detached from the real world and the average person right now, obviously, because if they understood it differently and the impact it's having on so many Americans of where we are economically, they would be galvanized into action to doing the things that they should be doing right now. So you need that competition of ideas and debate. It's healthy, it's important, it keeps you on your toes, and it keeps you in touch.
Senator, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Preface my question to you by saying I consider myself a conservative Republican, and I'm very concerned what direction my party is going. And about 1 hour talking to members of the Tea Party and try to convince them they're wrong, I come out a flaming liberal. But but my question to you though is, why can't there be enough moderate Republicans and enough moderate Democrats that come together using as their basis for discussion and hopefully compromise the Bowles-Simpson Commission report, which had 5 R's and 5 D's and 1 independent voting, 11 out of 18, which had a Corbyn on one side and a Durbin on the other side. Why can't that serve as a basis? Why is there enough votes to get that? And because each side had to give a little, each side got a little. Why isn't that the basis for compromise?
Well, you know, that was an unfortunate setback in this whole, debt issue, because at the time in which they came out with their report, it should have been reported to Congress. The president should have had them in, made a big, issue about, here is this report, important recommendations. I don't agree with everything. Let's send it to Congress, give the Congress a deadline, a date certain in the committees to take action or come up with alternatives to achieve the same savings, go to the floor, have the same, restrictions, and then get it done. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And then it translated into the Gang of 8. Again, it was 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats, conservatives, liberals, moderates, combined came up with a great proposition. And unfortunately, leadership would not bring it up for a vote in the United States Senate. And ultimately, a vacuum ensued, and where we are today. And so it should have happened. It requires leadership. It required the president. It required the congressional leadership to get behind it. But the forces decided not to get behind it. And now some of that has been done because of the sequestration, so about half of the $4 trillion. But we need another $2 trillion in cuts for the next 2 years just to tread water right now, to be the status quo without the debt really surging. So that was an important moment that was abandoned, frankly, and we would not be in the position that we are in today.
Senator Snowe, thank you for being here this morning. It's an honor to meet you. I miss watching you on C-SPAN. I miss watching our former congressman and friend Steve LaTourette on C-SPAN as well.
Yes.
He left Congress due to the hyper-partisan environment, as you well know. So 2 things. First of all, what are we left with if good folks like you leave Congress? And secondly, it seems that you have created an organization to assist candidates who want to work in a bipartisan fashion. Mr. LaTourette has created a similar organization. Hopefully, you're doing something to coordinate your efforts.
Yes, actually, we are, and I've joined, he's with the Main Street Partnership, and it's a group that I actually helped founded years ago with my husband and former Congressman Amo Houghton. And absolutely, in fact, I've talked to Steve, and we're going to raise money for those, you know, and help particularly those moderates who are challenged in primaries, or to, you know, support moderate candidates in primaries, so you just don't have, you know, the ideological extremes that emerge from the primaries, but you have more moderate-based candidates. And so that's what we intend to do. So, because that is the problem in America today, with where they're coming out of primaries. Instead of having center right and center left, you're just getting both from the far right and from the far left. And so people don't have a choice in the general election. That's why we should have more open primaries. So I am working with him, and then I've just got my PAC to help candidates and contribute, as well as will Main Street, to do that, because we just think it's vitally important. The reason why I left, because I know the young people in here, and I don't want them discouraged, because I've had people say to me on campuses, I was at the Ford Public Policy School yesterday in Ann Arbor. They said, well, you're asking us to get involved in public service, but you left. I said, well, you know, I'm at a different stage in life. Because now I have to tell people how it was, to make sure I can convince people to know that there was another way, and for current lawmakers who are new to the political process and the system, that it does work. And we need our young people to infuse that energy, the enthusiasm, and the collaboration that's so essential. If you don't respect differing ideas, if you insist on getting 100% of what you want, if you're saying that you're not going to talk to those with whom you disagree, that we can't move the legislation forward in this country, but we can't move this country forward. So I decided that I would contribute my voice in a different way. I'm on a mission about explaining how we can do it, and we can do it. My Spartan heritage tells me I'm a fighter, and I am, and I never give up. And so that's why I'm moving in this direction, and we're going to collaborate in all respects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Snowe. Today at the City Club, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Olympia Snowe, former senator from Maine and author of Fighting for Common Ground: How We Can Fix the Stalemate in Congress. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This program is now adjourned.